Good morning. My name is Kiran Kumar. I am working as a contract lecturer in DCCP branch at SRRS Government Polytechnic, Sirsilla. At SRRS Government Polytechnic, Sirsilla. The subject I am going to explain is joint stock companies. Joint stock companies. In that, the topic is types of preference shares and debentures. The types of preference shares and debentures. Types of preference shares and debentures. In the last class, I have explained, the last video, I have explained the different types of shares. The different types of shares. In the last class, I have explained the different types of shares. After completion of this class, the student will be able to know various types of preference shares and debentures. After completion of this period, this class, the student will know the student will know the various types of preference shares and debentures. The various types of preference shares and debentures. The various types of preference shares and debentures. In the last class, I have explained very clearly what is a preference share, what is a deferred share, and what is an equity share. What is a preference share? That is the types of shares. That is, these are all the types of shares. These are all the types of shares. Okay. So generally, we already know the companies requires three kinds of capital requirements. The company needs three kinds of capital requirements: long term capital, medium term capital, short term capital. Long term capital, medium term capital, and short term capital. The company requires long term capital, medium term capital, short term capital. The long term capital is procured. The long term capital is procured by issuing shares. The long term capital is procured by issuing shares. And the medium term and short term capital is procured by issuing debentures or taking loans from the financial institutions or taking deposits from the public by paying higher rate of interest. Here there are some differences between the various types of shares, that is deferred shares, equity shares, and preference shares, that I have explained in the last class very clearly. Once again, I will explain in a brief about deferred shares and equity, preference shares. And today's topic is preference shares and the types of preference shares. In that, the types of preference shares and what is a debenture. What is a debenture? These points I am going to explain in today's class. So before knowing to the types of preference shares, I would like to give a brief on deferred shares, equity shares and preference shares. The deferred shares are called as founders shares. The deferred shares are called as founders shares. Those shares are held with the founders of the company. Those shares are held with the founders of the company. Those shares are held with the founders of the company. And then second one, equity shares. Equity shares. Equity shares are called as ordinary shares. Equity shares are called as ordinary shares. Equity shares are called as ordinary shares. And the equity shareholders are the real owners of the company. The equity shareholders are the real owners of the company. The equity shareholders are the real owners of the company. And preference share, another type of share is preference share. So here the term preference meaning there is some preference will be given to the preference shareholders over the deferred shares and equity shares. The preference shareholder will enjoy, will be given preference, will be given preference over the equity and deferred shareholders. So the equity shares are called as ordinary shares and the preference shares are the preference will be given in distributing the dividend and giving the capital back to the preference shareholders, giving capital back to the preference shareholders will be given first priority from the residual assets of the company. Okay, and one more important the difference or preference is the rate of dividend is fixed. The rate of dividend is fixed to the preference shareholder. The rate of dividend is fixed to the preference shareholders. If the company gets higher profits or normal profits, the preference shareholders will be given the fixed rate of or amount of dividend. The equity shareholders will get the dividend depends on the successful running of the business. The equity shareholder will get dividend on the successful running of the business. If the business is running or the company is getting huge profits, the equity shareholders will get higher rate of interest. The equity shareholders will get higher rate of interest. The equity shareholders will get higher rate of interest. And the preference shareholder will get a fixed rate of interest but in distributing the dividend out of the net profits of the company, the first priority will be given to the preference shareholder. And in case of winding up of a company, in case of winding up of a company, in case of winding up of a company, the capital repayment, the capital, the share amount, the share capital repayment will be first, the first preference will be given to the preference shareholders, and then after equity shareholders, and then after deferred shareholders. Okay, so in these types of three types of shares, the rate of dividend is fixed to the preference shareholders, and there is no voting right to the preference shareholders. And in case of winding up of a company, the capital repayment first will be given to the preference shareholder. Then if the amount is left over, the next priority will be given to the equity shareholders, and then deferred shareholders. And the preference shareholders doesn't have any right to vote. The preference shareholders doesn't have any right to vote. The equity shareholders have a right, one share, one vote. Okay, that is preference shareholders are paid dividends first out of profits of the company. Preference shareholders paid dividends, preference shareholders paid dividend first out of profits of the company. The balance of profits is used for declaring a dividend on ordinary shares. Preference shareholders are paid dividends first out of profits of the company. The balance of profit is used for declaring a dividend on ordinary shares. At the time of winding up of a company, the capital of preference shareholders must be repaid first. So here we have to concentrate, we have to remember the points in case of preference shareholders in a joint stock company. The dividend will be paid first to the preference shareholder, that is at a fixed rate of amount, that is at a fixed rate of amount. That is one point. And the second point, and the second point is, in case of winding up of a company, in case of winding up of a company, in case of winding up of a company, the capital repayment, the capital, the share capital, the share amount, the preference shareholder share amount will be repaid first from the residual assets of the company. And the preference shareholders doesn't have any right, the preference shareholders doesn't have any right, the preference shareholders doesn't have any right to vote. Then the equity shareholders will get higher rate of dividend, depends on the profits of the company. It depends on the profit returns of a company. And the equity shares are called as ordinary shares. And the next, the priority will be given to the deferred shareholders. The first dividend is distributed to the preference shareholder, then afterwards equity shareholders, then afterwards deferred shareholders. These are the various types of shares issued by a joint stock company to make an arrangement of long-term financial needs, to get the long-term financial, to make an arrangement of long-term capital. Okay, generally we already know a company needs long-term financial requirement, long-term capital, medium term capital, and short term capital. Long term capital, medium term capital, and short term capital. So for arranging this long term capital, a company issues shares. Company issues shares. Okay, so a company issues a prospectus. A prospectus is nothing but inviting general common public to invest the money in the company in the form of shares or debentures. Shares or debentures. Okay, so there are three different kinds of shares. That is deferred shares. Those shares are called as founders shares. The deferred shares are called as founders shares. And equity shares, these are the general shares. These are the general shares, ordinary shares, common shares, and then preference shares. So depending upon the interest of the public, they can purchase, they can invest either by purchasing, either by investing their capital in the form of equity shares or preference shares. Okay, equity shares or preference shares. And the companies issues debentures. Other than these shares, the companies also issue debentures. What is a debenture? Okay, so I will explain what is a debenture in this class, and in detail about the debenture and the types of debentures. Okay, in detail about debenture and the types of debentures in the next class, okay, so here, what is a debenture? What is a debenture? Okay, so a debenture is a kind of loan. Is a kind of loan. A debenture is a kind of loan. Generally, the debenture holders, okay, generally the debenture holders will get higher rate of interest. It is not a dividend. It is not a dividend. It is only a interest. The shareholders will get dividend on the shares invested in the company. On their shares invested in the company, they will get dividend. Here a debenture holder will get interest on their debenture invested in the companies. A debenture is a kind of loan. It is a kind of loan. It is not an investment. It is the company is getting or taking loans from the general public by issuing debentures. And the debenture holders. Okay, so here for equity shares and preference shares, the equity shareholders and the preference shareholders will get a share certificate of their type. Okay, share certificate of the type. It may be in equity share or it may be in a preference share. The shareholders will get a share certificate by the common seal of the company, by common seal of the company, under the common seal of the company. The same way, the debenture holders will also get debenture certificates, that is the proof of their investment made in the company in the form of a debenture. Okay, so the same way, the share is also the people will get, or the shareholders will get a share certificate, that is a proof of their investment made in the company to the shareholders. There are different kinds of there are different kinds of preference shares. There are different kinds of preference shares are there. There are different kinds of preference shares are there. Cumulative preference shares, cumulative preference shares, non-cumulative preference shares, cumulative preference shares, non-cumulative preference shares, participating preference shares, participating preference shares, non-participating preference shares, participating preference shares, non-participating preference shares, redeemable preference shares, irredeemable preference shares. Okay, and then debentures. So in the debentures also there are some kinds of debentures are there. There are some kinds of debentures are there. So the first one, cumulative preference share. The first one is cumulative preference share. The dividend is paid whether the company earns profit or not. Here the first point is the dividend is paid to the preference shareholders. The cumulative preference shareholders, the cumulative preference shareholders will get dividend. The cumulative preference shareholders will get dividend if the company earns profit or not. The cumulative preference shareholders will get dividend if the company earns profit or not. The right of preference shareholders to receive dividend can be carried forward. The right of preference shareholders, the right of preference shareholder to receive dividend can be carried forward. The right of the dividend shareholders, the right of the dividend share, right of preference shareholders will be carried forward. Okay, so unpaid dividends on these shares go on accumulating. Unpaid dividends on these shares go on accumulating. Any dividend is paid on other classes of shares after such areas to cumulative preference shareholders are paid. Any dividend is paid to Any dividend is paid on other classes of shares after such areas to cumulative preference shareholders are paid. Generally, successful companies issue these shares. Generally, successful companies issue these shares. The dividend is paid whether the company earns profit or not. To the cumulative preference shareholders, to the cumulative preference shareholders, whether the company earns profit or not, the dividend is paid. The right of preference shareholders to receive dividend can be carried forward. Okay, so if in any case the dividend was not paid in the last year, that can be carried forward to the preference shareholder. It is nothing but accumulating of dividends. Unpaid dividends on these shares go on accumulating. Okay, if any case the dividend is not paid, if any case the dividend is not paid to the cumulative frequency shares, the name itself is saying cumulative. The name itself is saying cumulative. So cumulative means the unpaid dividends. The unpaid dividends will be accumulated if the company does not pay the dividend in the past, that will be accumulated to the cumulative preference shareholders if the company earns profit or not. Any dividend is paid on other classes of shares after such areas to cumulative preference shareholders are paid. Any dividend is paid on other classes of shares. Any dividend is paid on other classes of shares after such areas to cumulative preference shareholders are paid. Generally, successful companies issue these shares. Generally, successful generally successful companies issue these types of preference shares. Means the cumulative preference shares. Generally, the successful companies issues only the cumulative. Generally successful companies issues the cumulative preference shares or these types of preference shares. Okay, so the next one, non cumulative preference shares. The second type of preference share is the second one of preference share is non cumulative. So here the name itself is saying it is a non cumulative. The name itself is saying it is a non cumulative. So non cumulative means the dividends is paid, cannot be cumulated. The dividend is paid only when the company earns profit. The dividend is paid only when the company earns profit. The areas of dividend do not accumulate. The areas of dividend do not accumulate. So in the case of cumulative preference shares, for example, in the last year, the company uh, does not earn any profit. The company may be in the loss, and this year the company got huge amount of profit. The last year dividend and this year dividend is accumulated and will be paid to the cumulative preference shareholders. The last year dividend and this year dividend will be accumulated to the cumulative preference shareholders, because the cumulative preference shareholders will get dividend. The cumulative preference shareholders will get dividend if the company earns profit or not. The company earns profit or not. It means it doesn't depends on the profit or loss position of a company to a cumulative preference shareholders. If any year the company does not earn any profit, then that year dividend is accumulated to the next year and will be paid. The total dividend will be accumulated dividend will be paid to the cumulative preference shareholders. And in the case of non-cumulative preference shares, dividend is paid only when the company earns profit. Dividend is paid only when the company earns profit. The arrears of dividend do not accumulate. The arrears of dividend do not accumulate. The arrears of dividend do not accumulate. These shares do not have any claim over unpaid dividends of previous years. These shares do not have any claim over unpaid dividends of previous years. They can have the dividends during the current year profits only. Here, one point we have to observe is, if the company gets profits only, the dividend is paid to the non-cumulative preference shareholders. The company earns profit only, the dividend is paid to the non-cumulative preference shareholders. If any year the past the company does not earn profit, the dividend to this non-cumulative preference shareholders are paid. That will not be accumulated. These shares do not have any claim over unpaid dividends of previous years. These shares do not have any claim over unpaid dividends of previous years. These shareholders does not have any right to claim. These shareholders does not have any right to claim the previous year's unpaid dividends. They can have the dividends during the current year profits only. They can have the dividends during the current year profits only. Here, the difference between this cumulative and non-cumulative is, the cumulative preference shareholders will get each and every year dividend by accumulating to the next year. And in the non-cumulative preference shareholder get dividends only if the company earns profit in the current financial year. The dividends of the last year, if the company doesn't earn any kind of profit in the last year, that dividend will not be accumulated to the non-cumulative preference shareholders. Then next, participating preference shares. These shareholders will get a fixed rate of dividend. In addition to this, they are allowed to have a right on dividends over surplus profits. In addition to this, they are allowed to have a right on dividends over surplus profits after satisfying all other classes of shareholders. Thus, participating preference shareholders obtain return on their capital in two forms. Number one is participating preference shareholder. In the case of participating preference shareholders, these shareholders will get a fixed rate of dividend. In addition to this, they are allowed to have a right on the dividend over surplus profits after satisfying all other class of shareholders. Thus, participating preference shareholders obtain return on their capital in two forms: fixed dividend and the dividend excess in profits along with equity shareholders. Okay. These preference shareholders have an additional advantage over the equity shareholders or cumulative and non-cumulative preference shareholders. So the first thing is these shareholders will get a fixed rate of dividend. The first thing is the first we have to observe the first one is these shareholders will get a fixed rate of dividend. These shareholders will get a fixed rate of dividend. In addition to these participating preference shareholders have a special right on surplus profits after satisfying all other classes of shareholders. After satisfying all other classes of shareholders, in addition to this, they are allowed to have a right on dividends over surplus profits after satisfying all other classes of shareholders. Thus, participating preference shareholders obtain return on their capital in two forms. Thus, participating preference shareholders obtain return on their capital in two forms. One is fixed dividend and share in the excess profit along with equity shareholders. Fixed dividend and along with share in the excess profit along with equity shareholder. Okay. So here the participating preference shareholders will get a fixed rate of dividend, and if the company got a huge amount of profit, then the dividend is distributed to the preference shareholders in a certain ratio to the equity shareholders and other kind of shareholders or debenture holders, interest to the debenture holders. Then the remaining amount, if any left over, that remaining amount is again distributed to this participating preference shareholders. It means this participating preference shareholders will have a chance of getting normal fixed rate of dividend and the additional dividend over surplus profits. The additional dividend over surplus profits. This point we have to remember in case of participating preference shareholders. This point we have to remember in case of participating preference shareholder. The next one, non-participating preference shares. Non-participating preference shares. The preference shares which do not carry the right of share in excess profit are known as non-participating preference shares. These shareholders will not have the facility of participating in the excess profit. Here, the difference between this participating and non-participating. Here, the difference between the participating and the non-participating preference shares are: the participating preference shares holders have a right to get dividend over the surplus profits of the company. In this non-participating preference shares, in case of in case of non-participating in case of non-participating preference shares, the preference shares, this kind of preference shares which do not carry the right of share in excess profit, this kind of shares do not carry or do not have any right, this kind of share do not have any right to share in excess profits, to share in excess profits are known as non-participating preference shares, are known as non-participating preference shares. These shareholders will not have the facility of participating in the excess profit. These shareholders will not have the facility of participating in the excess profits. These shareholders will not have the facility of participating in the excess profits. That is the difference between this participating and non-participating preference shares. That is the difference between this participating and non-participating preference shares. Okay, is it clear? The next, redeemable preference shares. Redeemable preference shares, normally any amount invested, normally any amount invested in the share capital of a company, normally any amount invested in the share capital of a company cannot be returned during its lifetime, cannot be cannot be, it won't be paid back, the share capital won't be paid back during its lifetime, during its lifetime. But section 80 of the Indian Companies Act, but section 80 of the Indian Companies Act permits a public limited company, but section 80 of the Indian Companies Act permits a public limited company to issue preference shares which can be returned after a specified period. Section 80 of the Indian Companies Act permits a public limited company to issue preference shares which can be returned after a specified period. Such shares are known as redeemable preference shares. Such shares are known as redeemable preference shares. These shares constitute a good source of long and medium term funds required by a company. Redeemable preference shares. Redeemable preference shares. Normally, any amount invested in the share capital of a company, normally any amount invested in the share capital of a company cannot be returned during its lifetime. Okay, so the shares means you are investing, money in the joint stock companies in the form of shares, means the amount cannot be back again during the lifetime of the company. During the lifetime of the company, the shareholders will get only dividend. The shareholders will get only dividend on their investments, on their shares. But section 80 of the Indian Companies Act, but section 80 of the Indian Companies Act permits a public limited company permits a public limited company to issue preference shares which can be returned after a specified period. But Section 80 of the Indian Companies Act permits a public limited company to issue preference shares which can be returned after a specified period. Here one section, that is number 80 of the Indian Companies Act permits a public limited company to issue preference shares which can be returned after a specified period Such shares are known as redeemable preference shares. Such shares are known as redeemable preference shares. These shares constitutes a good source of long and medium term funds required by a company. Okay, so here the redeemable preference shareholders, here we have to observe one point. The redeemable preference shareholders will get their investment back as per the Section 80 of Indian Companies Act. These type of shares are known as redeemable preference shares. These types of shares are known as redeemable preference shares. These shares constitute a good source of long and medium term funds registered by a company. These shares constitute a good source of long and medium term funds required by a company. The next one, issue of these shares is subject to the following restrictions. Issue of these shares is subject to the following restrictions. It must be authorized by the articles of the company. It must be authorized by the articles of the company. These shares cannot be redeemed unless they are fully paid up. They can be redeemed only out of the profits of the company or out of the proceeds of a fresh issue of shares made for this purpose. Here, in case of this redeemable preference shares, these shares is subject to the following some restrictions, some conditions or some restrictions. It must be authorized by the articles of the company. It must be authorized by the articles of the company. It must be authorized by the articles of the company. These shares cannot be redeemed unless they are fully paid up. These shares cannot be redeemed unless they are fully paid up. They can be redeemed only out of the profits of the company. They can be redeemed only out of the profits of the company or out of the proceeds of a fresh issue of shares made for this purpose. These can be redeemed only out of the profits or the shares issued, fresh issue of shares made for this purpose. A fresh issue of shares made for this purpose. The last kind of preference share is irredeemable preference shares. Irredeemable preference shares. Preference shares which are not redeemed as long as company exists. The preference shares which are not redeemed. The preference shares which are not redeemed as long as company exists. Preference shares which are not redeemed as long as company exists. Okay, redeemable and irredeemable. The various kinds of preference shares are The various kinds of preference shares are cumulative preference shares, non-cumulative preference shares, participating preference shares, non-participating preference shares, redeemable preference shares, and irredeemable preference shares. And each and every of this type have advantages over than other types of preference shares. Okay, so I have clearly explained the different kinds of preference shares. The different kinds of preference shares, those are cumulative preference shares, non cumulative preference shares, participating preference shares, non participating preference shares, redeemable preference shares, irredeemable preference shares. These are all the types of preference shares. Okay, we have got an idea what is a share, what are the features of shares, and the types of shares. The types of shares are deferred shares, equity shares, preference shares, and the differences between this deferred share, equity share, and preference share, and various types of preference shares, various types of preference share. And debenture, we have to know brief. I will explain a brief about debenture, a brief about debenture. Okay, see, a company may finance part of its capital needs raising loans in the form of debentures. Every trading company has implied powers to borrow money for the purpose of its business. A non-trading company can borrow only when it is specially empowered by its memorandum of association. If a company for its expansion and development requires huge funds for a long period, it issues debentures to the public. Okay, for arranging the medium term or short term capital needs, a company may issue a debenture, or for long period, huge funds for a longer period. So debenture is completely differ from a share. A share is different and debenture is a different. A share is an investment of the shareholder in the company. The amount of share capital cannot be paid back to the shareholder throughout the lifetime of the company. And the debenture is a kind of loan. It's a kind of loan or a kind of capital arrangement of a joint stock company by issuing a debentures to the general public. By issuing a debenture to the general public, a company may finance part of its capital needs by raising loans in the form of debenture. So if a company for its expansion and development requires huge funds for a longer period, it issues debentures to the public. It issues debentures to the public. Okay, so a debenture is an acknowledgement, and debenture have a rate of interest. It contains terms and conditions, and it have a some rate of interest, huh? And it is given under the common seal of the company. Okay, so I will explain a detailed in detail about I will explain in detail about I will explain in detail about this debenture in the next class. In the next class. Okay. In this class, I have clearly explained or the series of the classes, that is last or before last class, and this class we have got an idea what is a share, what are the different types of shares, and what is a deferred share, preference share, equity share, and the types of preference shares, and what is a debenture, and the difference between this debenture and shares. I will clearly explain in the next class what is a debenture and the differences between this debenture and a share, and what are the types of debentures, the types of debentures. Okay, thank you.